Castlevania The Adventure was released extremely early on in the original Game Boy's life, December 1989 to be precise, and for lack of a better term, was a complete and utter disappointment for myself and many other longtime fans of the series. The one takeaway I remember was the music. It was quite impressive for its time, but everything else I felt was a letdown. Castlevania was one of my favorite series on the NES, and by late 1989 I had already played Castlevania and Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. And Nintendo Power was already teasing Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse. So you can imagine my surprise when I finally got my hands on Castlevania The Adventure. My initial reaction was, why is everything so damn slow? Where are all the secondary weapons? What the hell's going on? So let's talk about all of those things, shall we? For starters, it's clear Konami wanted to get a Castlevania on Nintendo's newly launched Game Boy as soon as humanly possible in order to cash in on early adopters, and I was unfortunately one of those people. Now the game isn't terrible, it's just flawed compared to the original NES adventures. You play as Christopher Belmont, who is on a quest to rid the world of Count Dracula. Okay, so you've heard that story before, but in those early days we didn't really need much more incentive to go on an adventure. That was good enough. And while the narrative may be familiar, just about everything else about this game isn't. Those famous staircases are nowhere to be seen. Candles are still here, except they drop coins, orbs, and hearts. Hearts are now used to replenish health instead of items used to throw your secondary weapon. As a matter of fact, the famous knife, holy water, axe, stopwatch, and cross aren't featured here whatsoever. Instead, Christopher has a whip that can be powered up with those orbs to eventually throw a projectile. The problem is the whip loses a power level every time you're hit, and it's extremely easy to get hit repeatedly, meaning you'll have the weakest whip more often than not. The biggest problem with The Adventure is that the programmers didn't know how to work with the Game Boy hardware at that particular point in time. The minute there are more than 2 sprites on the screen, the game drops from, I'd say, around 15 frames per second to about 5 frames per second. It's horrible. Even with no enemies on screen, Christopher feels like he's walking in molasses, which makes jumping so awkward, fighting annoying, and the entire experience, well, frustrating. The level design was what disappointed me the most when I originally played this game. Very little thought or effort went into building these levels. Most levels are made up of a series of rooms connected together by ropes or precise platforms you have to traverse. That isn't so bad in and of itself. However, when the exact same room appears again and again and again during the same level, you can clearly tell efforts went into other projects over this one. The visuals certainly look dated, however I will commend Konami for at least adding backgrounds to the stages, and the enemy designs aren't too bad all things considered. We all have to remember that the original monochrome Game Boy had a ridiculously low contrast level where sprites could very easily turn into blurry messes, but at the very least it's easy to see everything on the screen. The music, as I mentioned at the beginning of the review, is extremely impressive for this particular age of game. Sure, it's no Simon's Quest, but it remains impressive considering the technological limitations of the Game Boy and the speed at which this game was made. Castlevania The Adventure is an interesting history piece from a long time ago, but I can't recommend this one unless you're really curious to see how the first Castlevania game on a portable turned out. I can very easily recommend the follow-up, but I'll save my comments for a future review on that particular game. For now, I would suggest picking this one up via the 3DS Virtual Console if you absolutely must experience it. Otherwise, leave this one to history.